Hello, welcome to Lesson 1 of the Python logging course. I'm your instructor, Mike Driscoll. Today, we are going to learn what are logs in Python, why they might be useful, why you'd want to use logging versus just printing out like strings or other types of data objects, and we'll also create just a simple hello world log type script at the very end. So this will be kind of a short lesson. So what are logs anyway? They're human readable, so they're usually a data file type, kind of a text file, usually ending with .log as their extension instead of .txt for a text file or .xls for Excel or XLSX, depending on which version you have. Most logs include a timestamp, because if you don't have a date timestamp for each line in the log, you don't know, when something occurred. So let's just, and before we get to that, let's talk about why logs are useful. So actually we can look at this. Let's look at the sample log message. We can talk about why this is useful right here. So see, here we have a timestamp. This log message occurred on August 2nd of 2023 at about 1500 hours and 37 minutes, so around 3:30 in the afternoon. And then you have some seconds and microsecond and even more detail of when exactly it occurred. This part here is called the example app. It's the application that emitted the log message. And it will just tell you, if you have multiple parts of your application or you have multiple applications that you're logging from, it'll tell you, exactly which app is logging. And then the Python logging module includes different log levels. Now, a log level just identifies, the type of information that is in the log. So information in the informational level, which is what info represents, means that this could be useful information to you or to the customer even. Whereas if you set the log level to like debug, debug is almost always for the programmer or the software engineer, because you're trying to figure out why the application isn't working the way it's supposed to. And so you can set these different levels to increase or decrease the verbosity of the logs. So if you only want it to print out critical messages or warnings or things of that nature, you can change the log level so it only prints out less and less or more and more detail. It's really up to you how you want to set that. And then here at the very end is the actual log message, program started. So now you see there's 4 parts to your simple log message. You almost always want the timestamp. Most of the time you want the application, but you don't need it, because you could just name the log file after the application name. So it could be like, this gets saved into a file called myapplication.log. And then you'd have the rest of it. So you could exclude this particular piece, but that kind of gives you an idea. But why are logs useful anyway? Well, like I mentioned, they're good for debugging. When your application doesn't work right, you usually need some way to go back and look. And if you've been logging, you'll have a good detailed record of what's going on and why, if you've written your logs nicely. Sometimes you might use logs to trace a code path. Again, this is kind of a debugging type feature, but you might add a bunch of logs just temporarily, especially when you're working on new code. You'll add additional logs to help you refine it and make sure it's working correctly while you test it. And then you'll remove that extra logging code because you don't need it anymore after you've done your trace. There's a lot of companies that have to audit their code. And that means that we have auditors who will check and see, was the server properly modified by someone. So you can set it up so that in the logs it'll say what username modified what setting at what time. And that creates an audit trail, so that if someone were to accidentally delete a file that makes the server crash, we would know who that person was. It also shows someone's trying to log in with someone else's credentials 3 or 4 times in a row. Now we know what computer that came from, so we can go investigate and see who's trying to steal someone else's credentials, things like that. Root cause analysis. This is also a debugging thing where you can look at the logs, and sometimes you can determine from the logs, this was a coding error. This is the computer's hard drive got full. Internet was down. All kinds of different things can show up in the logs, and you can just tell that and figure out, this is a problem that IT has to fix versus engineering has to fix. Or, you might have to call your internet service provider and tell them, hey, we're having issues at, 2 a.m. Every Saturday or every other Saturday. What are you guys doing that's making the internet get so flaky? And of course, you can also use logs to record error reports or warnings. And so those are helpful. So, if you see a warning or an error that occurs at a regular time in your logs, then you can investigate that and find out, maybe they're applying updates at that time. IT is sending out updates and it reboots the computer or some other type of thing like that. Where if you didn't have this, you wouldn't know why your code is failing. You just know that it's failing at a certain time, but you don't have any logs to look at. Okay, let's talk about using print versus logging. So print, by default, will write standard out. And that means it'll just print to whatever console is available if there is one. And if there isn't one, you just kind of lose it. Print doesn't have any of those timestamps or other niceties. You'd have to add that yourself. So you don't have like a log level. You won't have the timestamp. You won't know what app it's from. You'll have to add all of that to each print statement yourself. Whereas if you configure the logger, it can do that automatically. And of course, there's no verbosity controls. Print always prints to the same level, so you can't control, whether you're getting debug messages versus errors or the other log levels that we'll learn about in a future lesson. So now you know kind of the difference between printing and logging, but you don't know how to actually do it. So let's just do a quick logging example. So in Python, you just import the logging module. It comes with Python. You don't have to do anything extra to install it. And then there's a couple of different ways to configure your logging module. We're going to show you the basic way to do it right here. Logging.basicconfig. You tell it where to save the log. So we're just going to save the hello log right here in the right next to wherever this is running. So, if you have mylog.py and you run this code, in that same folder where you've saved mylog.py, you will find that hello.log is saved there as well. We're going to set the logging level to info, which I believe is the default. So you don't technically have to set this, but we're going to set it so you know how to set it. So this is how you would set it, and you can change it to 4 or 5 other different levels, which we'll talk about in our next lesson. But for now, this is how you'd set it. And then we can run logging.debug, which will send out a debug message, logging.info, which sends out an informational message, and logging.error, which will send out an error message. So let's run that. And before we wrap up, I'm going to show you what the output looks like. All right, so let's just open another tab, and we'll jump over to my code, and we can see it created a hello.log file. So let's click on that. And you can see that now we have an info with a root, an error, and there's something strange here. We're not seeing a debug. So again, but this is getting a little ahead of ourselves, but when you set the level of the different logging levels, it'll exclude lower levels. So the debug level is actually less than the info level. And so when I set it to info, that just basically says we're going to ignore any debug messages, and that helps us control the verbosity of the logs. If I'd set it the log level to error instead, we would have only gotten the error message and not the info or the debug level. So that's what happened there. Let's see. We don't have a timestamp because we didn't set one. We can configure that, which we'll also learn in a future lesson. Root is the name of our app. If you don't set the name of the app, it just defaults to root. And then, of course, we have our message here. And you note it's not formatted like the example I showed you earlier. We're going to learn how to do all of that in a future lesson. But anyway, this is basically what a log script would look like in its most boiled down form. Okay, let's review what we've learned today. Today you learned what logs are in Python, why they might be useful to you, why you might want to use print print versus logging. Most of the time you'll want logging, but every now and then you might want to use print just for a quick and dirty debugging session. But most of the time you're going to want the logging. And then, of course, at the very end, we learned how to create our own logging script. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll watch the next video in the series.